I have an interesting question for you. What is infinity? Now, before I answer the question, I want to mention a few things. Nearly every religion that I've came across, every spiritual discipline, teaching, are all speaking about infinity. It sounds really cool. It makes your belly turn. You feel all warm inside. Infinity. Nothing could be bigger and better than that. But do you really understand what the claim of infinity means? And that's what we're going to focus on in this video. And as a matter of fact, I will be quoting directly from a Kabbalistic source towards the end of the video. So just hold on and you will see something really, really interesting that comes back from many, many, many years ago, where the Kabbalists speak about what infinity really is. Before we start, I just want to ask you a small favor. If you haven't done it yet, please just click the link below that says subscribe, and a bell will appear. Click the bell. You will be notified every time I upload a new video. If you don't click the bell, you won't be notified when I upload a new video, but you can still subscribe, and then whenever you go on YouTube, you will see my new videos. Well, with no further ado, I want to speak about infinity. What is infinity? Now, many people, the first thing they hear the word infinity, they think of something that continuously goes on forever. So, for example, space. You look up at the sky, you see that there's stars, and it just keeps on going. You look with a telescope, there's just more and more and more space. But is space infinite? Does it go on forever? We can't know about that. Okay, as a matter of fact, it's impossible. No matter how big our machines are, no matter how far our telescopes can see, we can see further and further and further. But that doesn't tell us that space is infinite. That just means it's longer and further than we have seen before. Now, when we see such long distance in the atmosphere, in the universe, we see such long distances that are far, far beyond anything that we can reach, we assume that it goes on forever. But let's take a very similar example. If you stand on a beach, you're looking into the ocean. You see that there's blue as far as you can see, right? Maybe the ocean goes on forever. As a matter of fact, there were people that thought that many years ago, where they looked at the ocean, they didn't see any land on the other side, and they thought that the ocean just goes on forever. But of course, one day we acquired the ability to see the global picture, and we realized that the ocean continues until it hits a land, and then that land goes until the end of the land, back to the ocean, and it just goes round and round. So we obviously see that the oceans don't go on forever. So what I'm trying to show you is that some person may look at the ocean, not know that there's land on the other side, and think that the ocean goes on forever because it's further than they can see. So when we use the term infinity, very often people are only referring to the fact that they think that it goes on forever. But there's no real way of knowing it goes on forever until you acquire the ability to know what forever is. But of course, in your body, in my body, we can't know what forever is. Right? So we look at space, it may end. We look at time, we think that the time always existed in the past, will always exist in the future. Says who? Maybe time has a beginning. Maybe space has a beginning. People tell me, well, numbers could just keep going. Says who? Right? Who says numbers could keep on going? We know that we can count as much as we could, and as much as we could count, we could still count more, but that doesn't mean that it goes on forever. Right? So we have no real way of determining what is infinity. If that's the case, how could anybody claim that there is infinity? Now, that's an interesting question in itself, and I'm not necessarily going to be dealing why people claim this, but I want to understand what the claim actually is. The claim is not that, listen, it just keeps on going and going and going. Okay? Because we can't know if it keeps on going and going and going. The claim of infinity is essentially that there is no end. It doesn't end. Not that it just keeps on going, it doesn't end. But if it doesn't end, then how does it have a beginning? And I'll tell you why, for example. Imagine if something is infinite in space. Let's take the example. It covers infinite space, right? Besides my room. So there's something that occupies infinite space, but it doesn't occupy my room. Is it infinite? The answer is no, because it doesn't occupy here. If it doesn't occupy here, it's not infinite. If you can find a place that something isn't, then it's not infinite. So for example, take numbers. Well, numbers start at 1. If a number starts at 1, then, well, there's a start. And if there's a start, it means there's before the 1. And before the 1 means that there's a place that it's not. And therefore, it can't really be infinite because it only goes in one direction. So let's just say something is infinite in space, but it's not infinite in time. Then it's not really infinite because it's infinite in space, but it's not infinite in time. Okay, so true infinity has to occupy everything and anything, both time, space, thoughts, right? We think, oh, there's an infinite amount of ideas out there. Well, infinity would have to be your ideas as well, and more, and infinitely more, because if it is not somewhere, it's not truly infinite. Right? And that's the Kabbalistic way of looking at infinity. Infinity is not just a reality that is a defined reality. So for example, if we say infinite water, well, if there can't really be infinite water if there is anything else. If there is even one stone in the whole universe, there cannot be infinite water because the water is not where the stone is. Okay, so true infinity has to occupy everything, not just everything in time, everything in space, everything in thought, and an infinite amount of possibilities that you can't even think of because you're incapable of thinking that. Now, spirituality in that situation, when we look at spirituality and we say the spirituality is infinite, well, if it's not here, then it can't be infinite because it's everywhere besides here. Right? The true claim of infinity from a Kabbalistic perspective, as well as from a mathematical perspective, a true infinity has to be here as well, right? And the concept described in the Kabbalah is that the source of everything is infinite. Now, why the source of everything has to be infinite? That's actually for another video, but it's an interesting conversation. There is a reasonable calculation to realize that the source of everything is infinite. Now, before I tell you that, I want you to understand what is source, okay? Everything that we see came from something else. You came from your mother, and she came from somebody else. A stone used to be one thing, and then it changed into something else. Planets move around and change back and forth. So everything came from something else, right? There is nothing that we seen that didn't come from anything else. Even scientifically, if you're gonna try to look at the theory of evolution, it started perhaps with algae and whatever it is, but how did the algae get there? The algae was there because of a certain atmosphere, a certain chemical that came together to create it, right? So everything we see in our world is coming from something else, that comes from something else, that comes from something else. However, that timeline can't go on forever. Now, scientists used to think that that timeline goes on forever, and that was till the Big Bang Theory. Since the Big Bang Theory, it is pretty accepted amongst scientists that all matter, all reality started at a certain point, that there's a starting point, right? And essentially, the concept of the Big Bang Theory, I would say the argument of the Big Bang Theory is very similar to some of the ancient Judaic theories as well, because the idea is that everything needs to come from a source, and everything stems from a source. But when you go back, everything needs to come from one source. Now, why does everything need to come from one source? You ever thought about that? So I'll tell you two reasons why everything needs to come from one source. The simple spiritual reason is infinity, right? Infinity needs to occupy everything. And if it needs to occupy everything, then there is nothing that it's not, and everything that is has to come out of that one single source. A famous question that I ask people very often is, how many infinite entities could there possibly be? Now, many people argue infinite, but that is wrong. There can't be infinite entities. There could only be one infinite entity, because if there is one infinite entity, it already occupies everything, and nothing is not it. Nothing is outside of it, and therefore there is no room for there to be a second, a third, or for that matter, infinite entities. There could only be one infinite entity. But another reason that I want to show you is that if something comes into existence, right, we always assume that there's something it came from. Now, if two things come into existence, then there has to be a reason why they both came into existence, right? Why would the same thing happen twice? If the same thing happened twice, means that there is a phenomenon or an ability or a capability that precedes that, right? And therefore, it's not the original source. It is a secondary. It came from an original source. The only problem is that there needs to be an original source, because how else would there be anything if there is no original source? Everything comes from a source that comes from a source that comes from a source that comes from a source. The second we say that there's two sources, if there's two sources, how did both sources get there, right? But if you say that there is just one source, that is the ultimate reality, that there's one source, well, that source is source, right? It is source, and it is infinite, and it is everything. The second you have anything that there's two, well, there has to be a reason why two could be created, right? As a matter of fact, the question that I ask many people, scientists, about this Big Bang Theory, here's an interesting question about the Big Bang Theory. Why didn't it happen more than once, right? They say that everything comes from one single point, right? One single point exploded and created everything that was out there. The whole universe came from a single, what some people call a single infinitely small point. Bam, the whole universe was created. And as a matter of fact, there is mention in Kabbalah of this infinitely small point that encompasses infinity. But I'm not going to get into that as well. But the question is if that happened here, why didn't that happen there, right? If there is one infinitely small point in one particular place in the universe, why wasn't there one of the same in another place? And that is something that I haven't really had a good answer for. If you have a good answer, right there in the comments, I'd love to hear it. But in reality, in reality, when you come down to the ultimate source always has to be one. Because if there's two, there has to be a reason that allowed both of them to get there. And therefore, the reason is their source. The reason behind how they both got there is the source. So if there was a phenomenon in the universe that made big bangs, if there was such a nature and such ability, it should have happened more than once. Why did it only happen once? Is because the source of everything has to boil down to one source. And that's, again, this is a lot of the reason why they believe in one God. In infinity, there has to only be one. There could only be one infinite, and it has to be the source as well. In this video, I don't want to go into how we know that there has to be an infinite source, because that's a little out of this particular conversation. It probably needs another video on its own. But as promised, I want to read from you a little piece of the Kabbalistic tradition written by Rabbi Chaim Vital in the name of the Arizal, who lived in Tzfat, where I am recording this video from. Okay. Now, before I read it, there are a lot of scientists that speak about this concept of infinity and consciousness encompassing everything, being everything, not having any type of shape or form, because it is beyond everything. And some people say, oh, well, this is just a modern, scientific conclusion and not something that goes before that. So I'm going to read from you. It's right here. Okay, it says, Da. You must know that before the beginning of everything was one simple light. Now, when we say light, it sounds very fancy, but light in Kabbalistic teaching could mean a lot of different things. We're not going to go into that, but there was one existence that it calls the simple light. V'nikra Ein Sof, and it's called Ein Sof, which means no end. And therefore, there was no empty space. And there was no emptiness, hollowness, and just plain air. It just didn't exist. Ella, there was no place. There was no place for anything else because this was an infinite light. Ella, everything was filled by this infinite light, right? And so that is speaking about source. Source is infinity. Infinity is everything. Everything is included in infinity. There's nothing that's not included in infinity, right? And so when you look at infinity, I hope that you understood for this video. If you have any questions, please put it down in the comments. Number one, there could only be one infinite entity, because if there was more than one infinite entity, then neither would be infinite, because each one would be in the space that the other one is not. That's number one. Number two, source must be one. Everything needs to boil down to a source, because if there's two, there must be a source that allowed both of those things to come into existence, and that's number two. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you haven't yet subscribed, please do me a favor and hit subscribe down there and hit the bell to get notifications on my next upcoming video. Another thing that I want you to do, if you have a few moments, click share, and YouTube will allow you to share this video on many different platforms so many people could learn about the true definition of infinity. Thanks for coming. Would love to see you again sometime. All the best. Bye-bye.